In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'm going to tell you the only reason why the Pelicans should fire Willie Green during the regular season. Plus, we'll talk front office and ownership. It's the Tuesday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with you on this Tuesday. Happy holidays to you and yours here, but maybe not to Willie Green, maybe not to the front office, maybe not to ownership. We're going to be a little bit critical in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans, looking at all three of those and what's going on and what's kind of led to this disaster of a season. And I'm going to tell you the one reason why, and there's really only one reason why the Pelicans should move on, fire Willie Green mid-season. I'll tell you what that is in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the number one Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are almost here, but it's not too late to get in on the regular season action with FanDuel, because right now new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So let's get into head coach Willie Green. And look, I don't think this is the long-term coach for the team. I don't think he should be the head coach next season. But I also think there's only one reason to fire Willie Green mid-season. And the too long didn't listen part of this is the only reason you need to fire Willie Green right now during the season is if you want to give James Borrego a trial run as the interim head coach, for the full-time job. Right now, this team is losing. They want to be losing. And if you were to functionally just move on from Willie Green, I think with what we've seen and kind of given how the guys are playing right now and the injuries still to Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson, it's not going to fundamentally change much for the regular season. Firing your head coach now at where you are with this record is not going to completely change the fortunes of the team and make them a playoff team. Like, that's out of the realm of possibility at this point. So you're losing. They want to be losing at this point. Firing Willie Green just from that doesn't make a ton of sense. But let's compare it to the Saints and Dennis Allen, because they just went through this. The biggest and most important reason for the Saints to move on from Dennis Allen and fire him during the season was the players hated him. The players hated Dennis Allen. And moving on from him during the season kind of stopped future dysfunction. The way it was told to me was that the players would rather lose without Dennis Allen than win with Dennis Allen. That's not the case here. The players don't hate Willie Green. I don't think he's causing long-term harm to the franchise in any capacity right now. He's just not the best head coach. It's really that simple. But given how the season is going and how this wears on players in a team, doing something to inject fresh energy seems like it could be a good idea. Overall, I don't think the players are going to resent the franchise. I don't think keeping Willie Green is going to make anyone request a trade. That's kind of your big concern here. And if that's not going to be the case, firing him, I don't know if you have to do it. Now, just because I said you don't need to fire him during the season doesn't mean I think he shouldn't be let go and that they shouldn't have a different head coach next year. I don't think Willie Green is a bad coach. He's definitely been hurt by the injuries to Zion and Ingram, and that's not his fault. But you also haven't seen the growth that you need to see from him. The same mistakes over multiple seasons now are being repeated, and this team is losing in ways that it shouldn't, and they frankly look worse than they should with the talent that they have. There seems to be a lack of game plan, particularly at the end of games. There seems to be no real accountability for players outside of like a rookie or two who then gets benched, but that same standard doesn't apply to other guys. You're seeing at times them maybe worried about some of the growth from some of the younger guys, the way Jordan Hawkins was handled last year. Look, even that Denver Nuggets game where Hawkins was the leading scorer and didn't take one single shot in overtime, find a way to make that happen, right? That hasn't occurred. So I just don't see the need to do it during the regular season. I don't think it's going to change anything. Now, you could say that's accountability from ownership for the front office to the fans. Sure, that's a valid thing to say, I think. But overall, look, I struggle to imagine him being back next season as the head coach of this team. So firing him now or later, I don't think it matters. It's not like you actually get a jump on trying like, who could we hire? It won't matter if you fire him the day or the week after the regular season ends or now. You're going to kind of still go through the same process. And the only reason is if you want to really consider giving James Borrego the lead job, him being the head coach. They missed out with Chris Finch a couple of years ago. During the bubble, there were reports that, David Griffin kind of inherited Alvin Gentry, wanted to move on from him, and didn't fire him during the season, but did after the year. You could have during the season. You could have elevated Chris Finch. They clearly didn't think that Chris Finch was going to be that great of a head coach. Otherwise, you would have done something like that. Finch eventually left. Now he's the head coach of Minnesota and seems to be one of the better, younger, up-and-coming coaches in the league. So if you think that's James Borrego, yeah, you fire Willie Green. You elevate Borrego, and it gives you a little bit more data on how he does it. What does the offense look like? Is there a boost in energy, or do you kind of go back to the same losing ways and nothing ultimately changes? If it does, then you're not going to hire him to be your next head coach, and at least you know that. And you're not going to then hire him and kind of run into a bad decision-making process. So to me, that's the main reason. The main reason is to move on from Willie Green to elevate James Borrego. But if you don't think Borrego needs to be the guy, or that's not who you want to hire, or maybe ownership's like, we're going to bring in a new front office, more on that in a second, to make that decision, you don't need to do this now. It might make you feel better as a fan, absolutely, because look, I do think coaching is at times, not always, but at times holding this team back at this point. And again, you haven't seen the growth. They struggle after timeouts. CJ McCollum shot in transition at the end of that Denver Nuggets game. That's on him for taking that shot. But the coaches have to do something about that. And Willie Green after that being like, yeah, we're totally fine with that shot, even if he isn't internally. It just isn't a good look for the franchise here. I also do think it'll look bad for the team if you fire Willie Green during the season. Just from a PR standpoint, the narrative from others is going to be, well, look at all the injuries he had. They're trying to scapegoat him. I don't think they're trying to scapegoat Willie Green if they do move on from him. I just don't think he's done a good enough job here. But the national media is going to be like New Orleans trying to blame it on the coach when it's on Zion, on Ingram, and other things. Maybe that's somewhat fair too as well. Something to keep in mind when it comes to all of that. So if the team fires Willie Green, let's say at the end of the season or during the season, there's going to be a new head coach this next year, who should make the hire? Let's get into what to do about the front office, because that one I think is more shades of gray. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Robinhood Gold. With Robinhood Gold, you don't need a silver spoon to eat up the financial favors of the 1%. Robinhood Gold allows others to get the rates and perks usually reserved for the high society. Now, the resourceful individual with Robinhood Gold can earn the very liberal rate of 4.25% APY on uninvested cash and be rewarded with a handsome 3% retirement boost on IRA account contributions. Robinhood Gold provides the privileges of a high net worth for any net worth, and these generous benefits are now available for only $5 a month. The new gold standard is here with Robinhood Gold. Sign up at Robinhood.com/gold. Terms apply. For specific disclosures, visit Robinhood.com/gold. Investing involves risk. Rate may change. Gold membership is offered by Robinhood Gold, LLC. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And make sure you're an everyday or listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. And if you want more Locked On Pelicans in your inbox, sign up for the daily free Locked On Pelicans newsletter over at LockedOnDaily.com. There's also really great national coverage in there and a lot of really good fantasy basketball coverage as well from the GOAT, Josh Lloyd, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So today we're talking about moving on from the head coach or the front office and what that would all entail. And I don't think there's a big need to fire Willie Green during the season. As I just said, I think the main reason is if you think Borrego is someone you want to hire, give him a trial run and see what happens. That's the only reason to really do that, in my opinion. But say they move on from Willie Green in some capacity, who's going to make the hire for the next head coach? Is that David Griffin in this current front office, or is it a different direction? So giving an assessment of the front office, I think, is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more difficult. Honestly, I don't think the front office has done a bad job on player acquisition, which in my opinion is the most important thing. They have some misses in drafting, some missing on potential trades, let's say. Look, looking back at Lonzo Ball, Lowry Markkanen and all that, sure, that's a miss there. But every GM has those sorts of things. Overall, they have talent on the roster, and that's the most important thing. This team with Zion, Ingram, DeJounte, CJ, Herb, Trey, we looked at this roster, even when there were flaws in there, say at the big man position, but look, they drafted well and drafted Yves Missi for that. Overall, they've assembled what you could argue is the most talented Pelicans team on paper that's ever been. Now, games aren't won on paper. Otherwise, this season, they wouldn't have just 5 wins. But you get the point that I'm saying. Talent acquisition, they've done a good job. They've done a good job in undrafted free agency, bringing guys up through two-way deals. Look at Najee Marshall, even if he's no longer with the team. Look at Jose Alvarado and others. They've done a really good job by doing all of that. And that's the front office, in my opinion's most important thing. Get good players on the roster and go and win basketball games because it's a talent-driven league here. So I think they've done a good job. Now, their public messaging from David Griffin and others I don't think is particularly great, but that doesn't also impact the product on the court. And more on this in the next segment. Something that I think is worth really as a big kind of check mark in the current front office's favor in David Griffin is that they've done a very good job of getting buy-in from ownership and getting more resources for the franchise here. A couple of years ago, when David Griffin started with this team, they were renovating, and they just did another renovation, but this is a couple of years ago. We're renovating the Saints facility to the tune of about $10 million. And so David Griffin was going to a meeting with ownership and whoever that kind of entails, right? That group, that side of the franchise, and was like, we need some money for upgrades. We need to renovate some things after, Dell Demps ran things. What's the budget I can have? And, they were going to try and talk money, and they were going to try almost lowball the Pelicans, not give them all the resources they wanted. And David Griffin's like, how much are you giving the Saints? They're like, $10 million. I'm like, cool, $10 million it is for me too. And then just left and kind of forced them to invest more resources in the team than maybe was what they had originally wanted to do. And so there's something to be said for that. Even David Griffin, for the faults that he has and mistakes that he's made, has pivoted to get off of those. What Dell Demps really struggled with was, the sunk cost fallacy of I traded for this guy and I traded all these picks for him, Omer Ashik or whatever. Now I got to pay him to keep him here because it justifies what I did before. Here, if something's not working, overall, David Griffin seems willing to rip the Band-Aid off, kind of be like, that didn't work. Let's go in a different direction. And that, in a sense, should be applauded. It's not fun to try and undo your own mistakes, Steven Adams or Derek Favors, but overall they've tried to pivot when they need to pivot, and I think there's something to be said for that, especially after having covered the Dell Demps era, where that absolutely was not the case whatsoever. And if this sounds like I'm fawning over the front office, I'm not. I'm going to be very critical of them in a minute here, but I think it's worth looking at both sides of this, right? Same thing with Willie Green. I don't think he's a bad coach. He gets a lot of buy-in from his players. He relates with them really well. They really seem to like him. There's something to be said for that. So he's done good in terms of drafting, in terms of free agents, when they've had money and all of that stuff. And overall is getting this team up to kind of snuff, an NBA standard, more so than they've been before. But you look at it and say the Brandon Ingram situation and the Zion Williamson situation, and there have been some serious missteps here. If they could have connected with Zion Williamson in a better way or sooner than they did, how would that have changed the trajectory of this franchise? Now, I think they're in a good spot with Zion Williamson now. I do think he does want to be in New Orleans and has a good relationship with this front office. There's something to be said for that. But should they have continued to build around Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson as long as they did? I think that's a valid thing to ask. And I think right now we're looking at it and it's like, no, you shouldn't have. And it's on them to kind of anticipate that and figure that out and kind of be forward thinking like that based on the data that they have. Look, getting a guy 2 All-Stars on the team is pretty impressive in Zion and Ingram, and trying to kind of build around those guys is an important thing. But if you realized it wasn't working, they let the Ingram situation lag a little bit too late, and now they're looking at not a great return back for him for a guy that is overall a pretty talented player. One more on that maybe in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans, because I do think it's going to lead to something interesting during the offseason that's worth looking at. So they've probably mishandled the Ingram situation. You know, the best time to ever trade a guy is on the first year of his extension, basically right after you sign him. The value kind of dips and goes down all the time after that. But if you're just signing guys to trade them, what's the kind of point of that, right? So building around them, I don't want to fault them too much for it because, look, honestly, it seemed like the right idea. But at the end of the day, it's a results-based business, and the results haven't been good. And maybe whether you're keeping them or not, you know, the front office is, I think, a tougher call, and it might have to do with what the vision for the future is. Is it building around Zion? Is there a plan there? Or is it kind of like we need to dump both him and Ingram and move on from them? I don't think this is nearly as easy as a decision as other people might think. You know, the injuries and other things, I don't know if that's not really like the front office's fault. This is things that have happened. And overall, they, you know, brought in the right type of medical staff when they started here, bringing in Aaron Nelson from the Phoenix Suns and all of that. You know, when the players didn't like how that was approached, they got rid of that group, and then they were really healthy last year for them, and then this year it's fallen off. Look, the front office has tried to do things to get better results, but you know, it's like Yoda, right? What's the quote? Do or do not. There's no try. Something like that. Kind of the thing here, right? At a certain point, we can talk process over results all we want, but you got to win basketball games, and they haven't won enough here. And the way they're losing now doesn't look particularly great either. So, what is their plan long term? And then here's the final thing with that. Maybe not the final thing, but something that's worth keeping in mind. This front office group, David Griffin, right? This is the second coach they've hired. They hired Stan Van Gundy, and that was a complete disaster. Fired him, moved on from him after 1 year. You know, then they brought in Willie Green. And again, I don't think Willie Green is a bad coach. I don't think he's the right coach for this team. I don't think that's the guy that they particularly need to have here on coaching this roster. I think, you know, do you give them a third crack at a head coach? They inherited Alvin Gentry. We don't need to kind of put that one under them. But do they get to hire a third head coach to try and coach this same group? You know, this is something they should have identified correctly. Part of it is you have 2 stars that kind of need different things. Zion needs a more of a disciplinary and stricter head coach. Brandon Ingram doesn't. Ingram hated Stan Van Gundy. I think Zion was kind of just like neutral on him, like blah, whatever, doesn't particularly care either way. Whereas Zion does like, you know, it isn't maybe play his best basketball under Willie Green because it's a little too relaxed, whereas Ingram kind of does because that's the type of coach that empowers him. So that I think has also made it really difficult is these 2 stars that don't complement each other on the court, but kind of look for different things in the like support and ancillary things around them. And that makes this really difficult. So do you give them a third crack at it? What if it's just Zion on the roster and no Brandon Ingram? Do you then maybe do it now that there's more clarity on the direction that the team should have? We'll find out. You know, again, I think they've drafted overall pretty well. They've done a good job of assembling talent, getting guys on the roster. That's, to me, the biggest thing. But it hasn't translated. And is it better to just go, okay, we're going to get a new coach. We have these players. Does a new GM, front office person, want to kind of take that on and figure out what they want to do with them? I think that's a valid thing to ask if that's the direction to try and go with it. But I do think it's a little bit more shades of gray, less cut and dry on the front office than Willie Green, who, no, I don't think should be back next year, kind of based on the way that things are going. Let's get into some ownership talk, because I actually think there is way more shades of gray to this than people realize. And I think the people being like, sell the team, are very missing the bigger picture here. And I'll explain what I mean. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are almost here, but it's not too late to get in on the regular season action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. And FanDuel has so many ways for you to pick up that win. Look, you got a big slate of games on Christmas Day for the NFL and the NBA. I like the Mavs -4.5 over the Minnesota Timberwolves on that one. But if you want to just get in on the player props, which player is going to score a touchdown, how many points will each team score, you can do that with FanDuel. And you can do that by just going to FanDuel.com and joining today. That's FanDuel.com for a chance at $250. Think about that in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday. We will be here every day this week, Monday through Friday, breaking down everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Want to make sense of the Saints game against Green Bay on Monday Night Football? Locked On Saints, Ross Jackson has you covered. He actually gave me that insight that I talked about with Dennis Allen when I was planning the show out. Shot him a text. Was like, did it fundamentally change anything? And he gave me some good insight to that and how it kind of compares to the New Orleans Pelicans here. So make sure Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, is your second listen today. And sign up for the free Locked On Pelicans daily newsletter as well. So let's get into ownership talk. I think Willie Green shouldn't be the head coach next year. I don't think you need to fire him this season. Front office, I think it's 50-50 on what you want to do there. But let's get into something that won't change, isn't going to change, and that's ownership. Gail Benson is not selling the team. Saying she's selling the team, spending time talking about it is a complete waste of time and isn't going to accomplish anything. I don't think Gail Benson is the best owner in sports. I don't think she's even close to the worst owner in sports either. And I've seen some social media graphics and all this, and look, you can say whatever the heck you want. I wish she would spend a little bit more on the Pelicans, certainly. But I think some of the things I've seen are completely incorrect when it comes to this franchise and what's going on with them. Completely incorrect when we look at it that way. Their ownership is fine, just fine, in my opinion. This is an organization that spends. They do spend. They just spent probably close to $30 million renovating both the Saints and Pelicans facility after they'd already been renovated multiple times already. That's not cheap to do. They've fired coaches mid-season or after the season and are paying multiple coaches at a time. They're spending. Just because this franchise is one that has never been in the luxury tax, and look, that's a fact, they need to at some point, but you don't need to do that just to do it to say that, okay, cool, we're not one of the only two teams in the NBA that's never been there. Show me the roster under Gail Benson's ownership or the Benson ownership that should have paid the luxury tax or ducked the tax to not do it. Those Dell Demps years, they weren't anywhere close to it, and they shouldn't have gone into the luxury tax for it. Last year, this team traded away Kyra Lewis Jr. to duck the luxury tax. That team shouldn't have been in the luxury tax. Don't, throw good money at a bad product. They're good enough to get in the playoffs. They weren't a title contender. Yeah, duck the tax, get that money, and use it on the team facility upgrades and things like that. They've done a good job of that, I think. Gail Benson has definitely spent. The Pelicans this year have depending on where you look, 10th or 12th highest payroll in the league. You can say that's not money well spent on the players, but it's not like they shipped Zion Williamson out rather than give him an extension when we all said the extension at the time was the right thing to do. They have spent money. The results haven't followed for a number of different reasons, but I honestly don't think it's ownership their problem with that. The facilities are really great over there. This is a small market. You're never going to get free agents really coming here, but also free agency doesn't work like that in the NBA, right? They went out and they signed Derek Carr's, whether that was good or not, to that big, massive deal. They have spent, I think, and so I don't look at ownership as a big negative. When they needed to revamp the player performance and care staff, pay guys a lot of money to not be here anymore, and Aaron Nelson, essentially, they did that. They had to pay Borrego to keep him. They did that, right? When guys are up for extensions, Trey Murphy and the like, they get the money here. They're not being cheap. This is not like when it was Donald Sterling with the Clippers, who just wanted to sell a bunch of tickets because he was in Los Angeles, get people to come in, and then never spend that money on the roster. You look at teams that have just slashed salary just to be cheap. And no, I don't think New Orleans has ever really done that, at least under the Benson ownership. Under George Shinn, different story. But at least now that hasn't been the case. And that's how we're going to evaluate this, right? So overall, I think some of the shots at ownership have been a little misguided. And it comes off as just like petulance of wanting to be angry about something. Gail Benson, I can tell you, definitely cares about both of these franchises. I think she's gotten better over time. I think, look, Anthony Davis leaving and the way he forced his way out had to do with ownership in certain things and stories I've been told and confirmed. And they learned their lessons from that, and they've been better. Are they perfect? No. Would you rate them as one of the best ownership groups in the league? No, absolutely. Or, in all sports, absolutely not. But also, and you can say this is a check mark for or against. It doesn't matter, or that we owe nothing for it. Look, the reason this team is here is because Gail Benson wanted to buy him and encouraged Tom Benson to do so. I think that's something kind of worth noting here. When you look at people who would keep the team here, it's Gail Benson. It's maybe Todd Graves of Raising Cane's if he wants to own the team. But if you sell him to anyone else, they're going to move from New Orleans. And that's not something I'm particularly excited about the concept of. So they've invested when they need to. When the team is good enough to, be worth paying the luxury tax for, I'm cautiously optimistic that they will. This team this year is not that healthy. I don't know if they were necessarily when you could deduct the tax by just trading away a minimum guy. We'll see when the time is right. If there's a year they should pay the luxury tax and they cheap out and don't, we're going to rip them on Locked On Pelicans because, look, I'm probably never going away from this podcast here. So, when you look at that, that's kind of how I view it. She definitely cares. Like, Gail Benson listened to the players with the Saints, and that's why she kind of led that decision on firing Dennis Allen. Mickey Loomis didn't want to do it. Look, you can question her devotion to Mickey Loomis and those people, and I think that's a valid thing to do. But overall, when they need money, they spend on it. And so I do think some of the shots against ownership is misguided. I also just like having the team here. That is why, and I've repeatedly said this, for all the talk about the new arena and everything and all of that for the fan experience, look, that matters. That's important. The biggest reason why is because, and this was missed in a lot of the reporting about it, the biggest reason why is you need to sign a long-term lease to keep the team here, because then you can sell the team and they remain here because they're locked in with that contract with the lease. Until that's done, do not sell the team under any circumstances. But I do think Gail Benson cares. She travels and goes to more away games than you realize to watch this team. A little bit more involved than you probably think with it all. So they spend. Their salary is higher than this year than the Philadelphia 76ers, than Cleveland, than the Clippers, than Memphis. A lot of other decent teams, they have higher salaries and are spending more money on than them. Again, that's on the front office for making sure that money's spent right. And a lot of this stuff has to do with injuries that they've spent money on trying to figure out what to do there. And it just hasn't worked. So certainly move on from Willie Green. 50-50 on the front office here. And ownership's not going anywhere, so we don't need to spend much time on there. But I definitely think shots at ownership's misguided. Everything else I think is completely valid about the criticism of David Griffin, of the criticism of Willie Green, and I agree with pretty much all of it. So we'll see. It's going to be definitely an offseason of change for New Orleans. Tomorrow, Christmas Day, we will have a show. If you got ideas, topics you want to hear about, when you need a break from your family, what have you, let me know in the comments down below or on Twitter at NolaJake. And that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. Look, I think the only reason you fire Willie Green is if you want to elevate James Borrego. Otherwise, just ride it out. It's not hurting you. Maybe you agree. Maybe you disagree. Let me know what you think in the comments down below on YouTube. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. And I'll be back with y'all tomorrow.